All right, thank you for joining us today for our NAL at ED Annual Performance Reporting webinar. We're going to be going through a lot of information today. If you have questions as we go through, I would encourage you to pop them in the chat box as they come up for you. If you are looking for the chat box, if you look at the bottom of your screen on the left side a little bit, but along that bottom toolbar, you should see a little chat bubble. And when you click on that, that will open up the chat box and you'll be able to pop your questions in that way. And we'll pause as we go along to answer those. So any questions that you have, this is a great time to get them answered. We've allowed enough time to be able to address all of them as we go through. So as we get started, we'll go ahead and do our official disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right, now that you're all officially disclaimed, we can really get started. So I think I've met most of you virtually. I'm Sarah Brightwell. I lead the OIE Technical Assistance team. And then hopefully most of you have gotten to know Jennifer Leo, your NAL at ED program officer. And you can check out her cool background today. That's really our new thing to do for everybody is, you check out whatever the Zoom background is for everyone on meetings these days. So today we're really going to break down your annual performance reporting by part. We're going to start out talking about the cover sheet and executive summary. Then we'll move to part A, part B, and finally part C, all the components. So as we start, I think it can help to really discuss why in the world do you do annual performance reporting? So in EDGAR, it really requires that recipients of these multi-year discretionary grants, which is what you have, a 3-year discretionary grant, that you submit an annual performance report that's going to demonstrate substantial progress. And that's a term that you're going to hear a lot today, and just in general, a lot in regards to your grant, that you always want to be showing substantial progress toward meeting your approved project objectives. So that's both your GEPRA measures as well as the project objectives for your specific project. Once you turn in that APR, it's reviewed and analyzed to assist ED in determining if you're making substantial progress, which then goes into the determinations of your continuation, funding, and things like that. So it's really, as I like to think of it, kind of a highlight reel of your last year of your grant. It's your chance to show off the great things that have been going on, whether it be in the planning of your project, the implementation, the student outcomes. This is your chance to really show off how this grant has helped you to do things in your community and with your students. So when you report, you're going to get to do that in G5. If you do not, as a project director, now not everyone can have access to G5, but as a project director, you should have access to G5. If you are a project director and you do not know how to get into G5, or for some reason your G5 is not functioning correctly, then you want to reach out to the help desk and get that fixed now. That's not something you want to be trying to fix when you're actually trying to submit your APR, because that's an added level of stress you don't need. So reach out to the help desk. You'll see that they are open 8 to 6 Eastern, Monday through Friday. They have a toll-free number there. They have a regular phone number, and they also have an email. So you can do whatever works for you best, but reach out to them and make sure that you are able to get into G5 well before you're trying to turn in your APR report, because this is where you're going to be doing all of that reporting, is right here in that system. And only your project director is supposed to input that information. That's why they're the one that has the G5 account. Now we'll talk about as we go through how you can work as a team to put together the information that your project director will then submit in G5. All right, so when you're doing your reporting, we use things called ED524B Forms. That's the official form for your APR and FPR. So your annual performance reports and your final performance reports. And when you look at those ED524B forms, it's a cover sheet, an executive summary, and that section A, B, and C. Now, all of those forms are contained within the G5 system, but they're also available as Word documents and PDFs that you can access at this website here on the screen, which will also have this information because I'll send out the slide deck after this, and I'll include that link in the email as well. So if you're trying to frantically write that down, don't worry, I'll provide that for you. But that's where you can also download those Word documents and PDFs if you want to see them in advance before doing it in G5. Now your timeline. So your APR application was available in G5 starting March 1st. So you may or may not have noticed that it was in there. You would have received a little notification in the G5 system that it is now open. So you could even start inputting information now. We're having our APR webinar today, March 8th, and then your APR is due May 3rd at 4:30 Eastern. And you notice we went all the way to the trouble of putting 4:30 in 0 seconds. That's because that's how particular the G5 system is, which means that if you turn it in at 4:30 and 20 seconds, it's too late. The G5 system is closed and it's not going to take your report and you're going to be a little frustrated. So you really want to make sure that it's in there by 4:30 Eastern. Here's my true recommendation to you. Don't submit it May 3rd. Submitting it May 3rd is going to cause your blood pressure to rise because everybody's trying to submit their APRs on May 3rd. If you think you're the only procrastinator out there, as a fellow procrastinator, I can tell you, you are not alone. There are going to be a multitude of folks trying to do it that day. You'll see Brandon from Anchorage, who is one of our original cohorts, he's had that lovely experience of what happens when G5 gets a little overloaded, because you have to think about there are other OIE grantees and then other just Department of Ed grantees all descending upon the G5 system May 3rd. And it gets angry and it gets really slow. And it won't extend that deadline just because it was really slow. So if it keeps timing out and not doing what it's supposed to, you could miss that deadline just because it was really slow. So definitely encourage you, you have a good 2 months before this report is due. Get it done, get it submitted early, and get it off your plate. So let's jump into the actual reporting piece. So as we're looking at this is your APR cover sheet. Now, this is a 2-page document. And as we go through, there's some pieces and parts that I want to make sure that you've noticed. You'll be completing the whole thing, but there's a couple that are kind of specific in how we want to complete them. So first off, make sure that you put your PR award number. Make sure it's the correct PR award number for this current NAL ED grant. Next up is your reporting period. Your reporting period is going to be from October 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. So your grant started, or the grant year for Albuquerque started October 1st, and it is going to be reported on through the end of March. Now, of course, your grant year keeps going. Your grant year ends the end of September, but because these annual performance reports have to be turned in prior to that, you're only reporting on what has occurred in your project through the end of March. Okay, super important on that part. And then when we look at the budget, some important tidbits on that. This should only reflect what you've actually spent, and that means obligated and drawn down, so drawn down from G5. So these amounts that you're going to put in number 8 should match G5. So a couple of tips on that. When we're wanting to match G5, many of you may not have access to the fiscal part of G5. So you're going to need to do one of two things. At minimum, you need great communication with your fiscal office, and in particular, the person who does your G5 drawdowns, because you need to know when those drawdowns have happened and for how much. The ideal situation is if you're able to request G5 view only access. Okay. Now, what this means, because it always, if not fully explained to your fiscal office, will make them nervous. If you just say, I want access to the fiscal part of G5, they may panic because they don't want you to have access to be able to accidentally draw down money. You don't want that either. You want view only access, which means you'd be able to see when drawdowns occur and for how much, but you can't literally make any changes to that fiscal part. Okay. So that's going to be really, really helpful with your reporting if you're able to do that. Okay. So as you're thinking about that, just think if that's something that you might want to pursue. I'm happy to help you walk through the steps of how to request that view only access if you're not familiar, but it can be super, super helpful because then you're able to just open up G5 and see those drawdowns and use that for your reporting. So, okay, back to 8 when we're thinking about how we're going to report this. So as we're thinking about it matching G5, for 8A, that's going to be a little bit different. If you are Albuquerque, our continuing grantee, you're going to put in to 8A your expenditures from the last grant year. So from October 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2020. Okay. So the previous grant year. If you are a new grantee, which is everybody that's not Albuquerque, leave 8A blank. You don't have a previous grant year. Okay. When we get to 8B, thank you for the question, Brandon. Yes, there is a typo. Despite the fact that about 6 different people looked at this, you had the eagle eye for 8B. So we'll fix that in the slide deck before I send it back out. But yes, your total expenditure should be from October 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, the same as your reporting period. So that's also important to think about with any of this, that even though G5 is open right now, you need to report through the end of March. So you shouldn't be completing any of that fiscal information until March closes, because likely and hopefully your budget office is going to do a drawdown in March, which would then change your information. This is also a good time when thinking about that budget piece, that if you look at those drawdowns and you realize that your budget office has not been drawing down money, then you have time to get them to do a drawdown so that it is more accurately reflecting your spending prior to the end of March. Okay, so 8C is your entire project period. None of you should be filling in 8C. Okay, that's something that's only completed on final performance reports, and that's not what any of you are doing. Okay, so 8A, only Albuquerque fills out. 8B, everybody fills out. 8C, nobody fills out. All right, next up, indirect cost information. So most of you are completing this part because you are claiming indirect cost. If you are not, mark no, and that's fine. Mark that on 9A and move on. If you are, which is most of you, then you're going to mark yes on 9A and then the applicable option on B through E. Most of you, that's going to be marking B and then inputting that indirect cost rate. Important that it does need to have documentation that is up to date. So if you just had a change in your indirect cost rate, this is a great time to submit that paperwork to Jennifer as well. All right. So that's that entire chunk in the middle there. Then as we move to 10, everyone should mark not applicable for question 10. And for question 11, everyone should mark yes. This is in regards to your data privacy and security measures certification. For this, you can include whatever your district or organization policy is for data privacy. Often that's included in like a student or staff handbook, and you can just utilize a copy of that for that. All right, then we go to the back. So this is the second page of the cover sheet. And the first part is asking some information about your performance measure status. So it's asking, are complete data on your performance measures for the current budget period included in the project status chart? For many of you, I would fathom most of you, you're going to be saying no, because since we're only doing our reporting through the end of March, a lot of the data that you would be reporting might not be available to you yet. And that's okay. You can mark no. And then right here, you're going to include when that data is going to be available. So is that going to be available come August? Or is it going to be available in September? Just look at what data you need to come back and fill in, and we'll talk about that in part A, and when that would be available. If you are able to complete all of your reporting and you don't have to put that data is not available for anything, then you can mark yes, and that's fine. But if you mark no, which like I said, most of us will be marking no, just make sure that you put in that date of when that data is going to be available. And then the final part is that you must have a signature from your authorized representative, and it must be an actual signature. You can then take that and scan it, take a picture of it, whatever you have to do to be able to do that and upload it into G5. Now I say upload it into G5 with this caveat. Most of the time, G5 plays nicely and allows you to upload that cover letter. If for some reason it is not accepting the upload, two things can help. One, try it as a PDF. It does tend to upload PDFs better than other types of files. And if it just absolutely won't do it, then you're going to email it to your program officer. So you'd be emailing it to Jennifer. So that's kind of your backup plan if for some reason it won't take it. If you are not sure who your authorized representative is, you can always reach out and we can make sure that that's the correct person. This is also why we were checking everybody's contact information over the last month or two, is just making sure that the correct person was in the role of project director for submitting this, and the correct person was in the role of authorizing representative to be able to sign this. This is another thing I would not wait to the last minute for. Often the authorized representatives are the chairperson of the tribe or the superintendent of the school district, folks that can sometimes be a little bit hard to get a hold of for signatures. So as soon as possible, I would complete your cover sheet as soon as you have all the information you need and get it signed so that you're not worried about running around getting signatures at the last minute. Then we go into the executive summary. So the executive summary does have a 2-page maximum. If you're writing it and you realize I have way too much information for 2 pages, don't worry, I'll show you another place in your APR where you can put that additional information. But for the actual executive summary, it is supposed to be a 2-page maximum. And this is a place where you can highlight your achievement and progress towards your project's goals. However, you don't want it to just be a complete repeat of what you're going to write in section A. So really think of this as your high-level overview. An executive summary should be that high-level overview of what's been happening thus far this year in your program. So what outcomes have you been achieving? What outcomes, did you maybe overachieve your target? What are some hurdles that you've encountered? I know some of you have had turnover in staff or staffing delays. There have been some various impacts on your programming and what you had planned versus what was feasible due to COVID. Those are the types of things to address here, as well as any contributions that your project may have already made to research, knowledge, practice, and/or policy. Although that last bullet tends to come in a bit more toward the end of your project. But think of this as that just high-level overview of what's been going on in your project these first few months. Then we get into section A. So section A is where we're going to do the majority of our reporting. This is the form. Like I said, you can get it through the ED524B Forms, and then you'll input it directly into G5. It is also the exact setup of your project planner. So if you're working through the project planner, then it's set up exactly as this form to make it easy to copy, paste, and keep records. Now, as you're doing your reporting in Part A, the first thing you want to think about is what type of performance measure are you reporting on? Because you're going to report on two different types. You're going to report on GEPRA measures, and you're going to report on project measures. The GEPRA measures are the ones that are for everybody and are required of every grantee. And your project measures are specific to your grant and will show progress your project has made toward your objectives. Okay. So GEPRA is for everybody, project is specific to you. So let's look at GEPRA measures first. When we're looking at GEPRA measures, you're going to report only on the ratio in the actual performance data. So what I mean by that is when we come across here, first you're going to write GEPRA here in this measure type. Okay. Then you're going to come over and notice everything under target I've put an X in. It's not because you're really going to write an X, but I wanted to really highlight for you, you're not putting in a target for those. You're only coming over here under actual performance data and inputting a ratio. Now you'll notice G5 is going to auto create a percentage for you, but you're only entering right here where we have it in red, that ratio. Okay. Then for your project measures, for those, you are going to have a target and an actual. So based on whatever your project objective was here, you're going to put in your target ratio and then your actual ratio, whatever you actually achieved during this reporting period. So still only ratios. Notice we're only putting ratios, but you've got a target and an actual. Okay. So a little bit more information. So the GEPRA measures help OIE and the department see the progress of your project and each grant program as a whole. So this is where it really goes into kind of tracking and looking at substantial progress. Remember that just as we talked about before in the cover sheet, your reporting period for this is October 1st to March 31st. So as we start thinking about some of these GEPRA or some of the things that are project objectives for you, you may start to see there are some things that you're definitely not going to have data for. That's okay, and that's expected. But there's going to be two different things to think about with this. If it's data that's unavailable, but you're going to have it available prior to the end of the grant year, so prior to September 30th, 2021, then you're going to denote that with 999. So in the ratio box, you're literally going to type 999. Which doesn't make sense because it's not a ratio, but that's how the system works. 999 is a signal to the system and to OIE that you don't have the data right now, but you will have it before the grant year is over. Now, there may be other objectives that data is not available right now, and it's not going to be available or exist by the end of the grant period or by the end of the grant year. So by September 30, 2021. In those instances, you're going to report a 0. Okay. We'll talk about how to then explain both of these next, but just really, really make sure that you've got down, in your notes, if it's unavailable, but you'll have it by the end of September, 999. If it's not available and it won't exist by the end of September, it's a 0. Okay. Then we get to the explanation of progress. So this is where you would be able to explain the data that you're putting in quantitatively at the top, as well as whether if it was a 999 or a 0, explain why it's a 999 or 0. So you're going to, in this explanation of progress, be expected to demonstrate how you've met or made progress toward each of your measures. So we're going to want to talk about what data was collected, when it was collected, how you analyzed it, and any activities that you did as part of your project that led to that outcome. If you have not made progress, or maybe it wasn't met and the deadline for that particular objective that you've written has passed, you want to talk about why. So if you're delayed in things, there's something that's happened, a challenge that's been encountered, a hurdle. Talk about that, explain what that is, how that was a setback, and then talk about what steps you've put in place to move forward so that you can make progress. So it might be reassessing a deadline or bringing on a different person to help with something. Talk about what you're doing to handle that challenge and move forward with whatever objective you're reporting on. Make sure that if this is one that you're reporting a 999 for, include in that narrative why you don't have the data yet and when you'll have that data. If it's one that you're reporting a 0 for, make sure and discuss why you won't have any data for that in the first year of your project. Okay. The explanation of progress is very important. We want robust explanations. This is not the time to be brief in your explanation. This is your chance to really provide that extra context and picture behind your quantitative data. So let's look at your GEPRA measures. So as we think about those things that all of you are going to be reporting on, there's 4 of those. The first is this measure of native language proficiency. Now, the key things to think about here are, what does proficiency mean to you? The department has not set any guidelines for what proficiency means. You and your team, as part of your project, will determine what proficiency means. Okay. When we think about number 2, we're thinking about progress. Okay. So when we think about number 2, again, the department has not set forth what progress is. You and your team have to determine for your project, what does progress look like that you're going to be measuring? And then for both of them, you need to determine, how will you be measuring native language progress and proficiency? So what tool, what assessment tool are you going to be using? I know many of you, as part of your project, plan to create an assessment. When will that be ready? Do you need something that you can use in the meantime until it's done? Or will it be completed, or at least in draft format, soon enough for you to pilot and have some data? Thinking through that. Some of you right now don't have students engaged in programming and won't until school starts in August, September. So you would not be able to report on this. Some of you already have students engaged in programming, and so you should have information regarding their proficiency and progress. Now, you might not have it yet. You may have to put 999 because they might not be taking their language assessment until, say, April or May, and that's fine. But if you have students engaged in programming right now, this is something that we would expect that you would have some data for. Then as we look at number 3, we're looking at academic improvement. So when we think of academic improvement, this is another one where you and your team have to determine, what does improvement look like and how will you be measuring that? Really think through what's going to be most useful for your project, and think about when that information will be available to you for reporting. And then the final GEPRA here is in regards to average daily attendance. The big thing to think about here is, notice in the wording, it says the difference between the average daily attendance of participating students and the average daily attendance of all students in the comparison group. That means you need a comparison group. What comparison group you use is up to you and your project to determine. I can tell you as far as previous grantees, many, if they were in a school or an organization where they had a significant number of students participating in the language program and a significant number not participating in the language program, they would often use that as their comparison group. Kids who were in the same either program or school, and do non-participating versus participating as their comparison groups. For some of you, it may be basically your entire school that's participating in the language activities. So that may not be an available comparison group for you. So at that point, you may need to think about, is there a comparable school that you could use as a comparison group, or another comparable program you could use as a comparison group? And as you're determining your comparison group, an important consideration is, will you have access to that data? Because sometimes it's easy to think, oh, well, this school down the road would be the perfect comparison group for us. But if you don't have an agreement with them to be able to get their average daily attendance information, you might be waiting until it's published, say, by the state, which sometimes might not happen until late fall. So really think through when you're selecting that comparison group about not only what would be a good applicable comparison group, but what data do you actually have access to be able to do your reporting. Okay. So as we think through those, as you're working on how you want to measure those, if you have questions, if you want to talk through anything, please reach out to the TA team, and we're happy to kind of sit down and walk through any of that information with you. That's what we're here to help with. So let's now take that into what does it look like in reporting? And that will also address our next chat box question. So you'll see here in the reporting, this is how we're going to report on our GEPRA measures. Now, first of all, an important thing to point out is you'll notice here, I did not change one single word of that GEPRA because I can't. The GEPRA measures have to be included here in this performance measure area exactly as they are written. Quick copy and paste, and they're already in your planner word for word, so that makes the copy and paste pretty easy. On this first annual performance report, you're going to be reporting your baseline data and your year one data. Okay, so baseline data would be prior to your program starting, what was occurring, and then year one data is this reporting period, October 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. Now you'll notice here that in my fake example, 10 of my 100 participating students were considered proficient prior to the start of my native language program. Now here in my year one program, I've had to report 999 because I'm going to give my students, I already gave them the pre-test at the beginning of the year. I'm going to give them a post-test at the end of the year in May. I haven't administered that test yet though, so that data is not available. So I have to put 999. And then when I have that information available, I'll update that data. Okay. Now there's a question in the chat box as far as if you are a previous NAL grantee, should you use that data as baseline with this one, or are you starting from scratch? So depending upon which project you are, because we have a couple of projects that are continuing, if you're using the same student group, then yes, that would absolutely be your baseline, and how wonderful you have a baseline to conveniently pop in. For some of the continuing grantees, you're now doing something completely different with like a completely different group of children. So you wouldn't necessarily have that baseline available from that group, but you may have it from other data sources. So it is going to depend on your project, but like for your project specifically, Brandon that asked the question in the box, yes, for yours, because it is a continuing, you'd be able to use your old data as baseline. And Veronica, that is a great question. I'm going to come back to it in just a minute, just so you know I'm not ignoring your question, but we will get to that piece. All right. One important thing to note is that while I did not change any of the wording on my GEPRA measures, I did include that this was my baseline data and this was my year one data, just so that it's really easy to tell the difference in my reporting. I made sure and indicated that these were GEPRA measures, and only those 4 are my GEPRA measures. And then you'll notice I only reported my ratios under actual performance data, reporting that 999, where I know I'm gonna have that data, but I don't have it as of this reporting. And then my explanation of progress. Now, I was trying to make it nice and concise to fit on a slide. You'll have more space than that to be able to actually do your explanation of progress. So just keep that in mind, but making sure that you're addressing all of those questions we talked about and giving a nice explanation. All right, now let's look at for your project objectives. So those objectives that you set that are specific to your grant project. Now you'll notice again in this one, I've got 2 because I'm doing baseline in year 1. So my wording is the same year to year. Once you set your project objectives in this first APR, those are the project objectives that you'll be using throughout the life of your grant. And we can also look at those more for those that have already done their reporting coaching session. We've looked at those that it's upcoming, we'll look at those as well, but just keeping that in mind. You'll notice that I've marked these PROJ. That's what you write when it is a project objective to denote GEPRA versus project. So you'll pop that in. And then because these are project objectives, not GEPRA, you'll see that now I have a target. So my objective was that I wanted to recruit at least 120 students. And so I want 120 out of 120. Baseline, I had 0 kids in my program because it didn't exist before. So my baseline was 0 students out of that 120 goal. But then you can see it's another one where I had 999 because my project is not actually enrolling students to start the language activities until August. So again, I'll have the data by the end of September to be able to update how many students were enrolled this first program year. However, I don't have it as of this reporting, so I have to pop in that 999. And then I'll update it. And then again, with a nice robust explanation for all of that information, providing that context. Okay, so that's part A, which I said, that's going to be the bulk of your reporting really, is doing all those GEPRA measures, project objectives, and all that explanation of progress for each. But then we move into section B. Section B is your budget information. Handily, B for budget. You're going to use this section to write a narrative that's going to describe all your spending for the current project year. So again, just for that reporting period, October 1st to the end of March. Now, the part that's a little bit different, when we were doing our cover sheet, we talked about how we wanted the information for number 8 on the cover sheet to match G5. So it had to be monies that were drawn down. When you get here to this narrative section, we want to know what funds you've expended, meaning obligated, even if it hasn't been drawn down in G5 yet. So if you know that you've already bought all these materials, but your budget office hasn't drawn it down yet, but you've spent that money, that's when you can talk about that here. So basically talking through any things that you've spent but have not been drawn down in addition to what was reported in 8. Okay, so talk through all the monies that have been spent. It's easiest if you break that down by budget category. Talk about your G5 drawdown frequency. So ideally, We would love to have G5 drawdowns happening each month, but at minimum, they should be happening at least once a quarter. Technically, you could draw down from G5 every day if that's what your budget office wanted to do. I've yet to see one who wants to do that, but it's not a dilemma of drawing down too much, but it is a dilemma when you draw down too little. So discuss, is there a schedule in your organization for drawdowns? Do you draw down quarterly? Do you draw down monthly? Is it just an as necessary drawdown and there's not a particular schedule? And if drawdowns aren't happening at least once per quarter, which would mean that you've had at least 2 drawdowns in this first part of the year, then really talk about why are the drawdowns not happening on a regular basis? What do you plan to do to try and remedy that? And then how are you as a project manager and project director tracking your expenditures independent of your budget office so that you're not relying solely on their accounting? And then we ask you to do a little bit of conjecture. So if you anticipate that you're going to have any unexpended funds remaining at the end of this grant year, discuss how much you think is going to be remaining and why. Now, I say that with the caveat that it is expected that you will use the monies in the way that it was written in your grant and draw down in accordance with that. So ideally, you would not be having carryover, especially large carryover amounts. If money is not being expended as expected and you have large carryover amounts at the end of the grant year, there's a potential for budget reduction, and nobody wants that. So make sure that you are spending and drawing down the money throughout this first year. But if you think that you are going to have some unexpended funds, go ahead and denote that here if it's already something that you've got on your mind. So whether that be potentially salary for someone that wasn't hired, maybe some professional development funds that didn't end up getting used because something was canceled, maybe a conference due to COVID that didn't actually get to happen, include any of that information here, but also just be making best efforts to expend throughout this first year. We will also provide you, when I send out the slide deck afterwards, I'll also provide you with an optional budget reporting form that you can use that will have a place already set for all of this information, with the exception of the G5 drawdown information. You would still need to put that in this narrative piece, but it would have a place for all of this other data. Now, if you anticipate that you're going to have any unexpended funds remaining at the end of the year, make sure to discuss how much you think is going to be remaining, making best efforts to spend. And then here's the second part of that as we get into that piece. And again, this is stuff that you can include in that optional budget form, making this a little bit easier. But if you want to carry over those unexpended funds, you need to indicate the portion that you would want to carry over and how you plan to use it in the next budget period. So basically in year 2 of your grant. It would have to be to complete activities in your approved application. You couldn't add additional activities beyond what was already approved in your grant application. This is also the place where you could describe changes that you wish to make in your grants activities for the next budget period that are consistent with the scope and objectives of your approved project application and consistent with any carryover requests you might have already been discussing. So as we wrap up that budget information part, the key part is to really try to expend your monies in the way in which they were intended to be expended in your project this year. Complete either the narrative part or the optional budget form that has all of those components already in it for you to be able to really provide detail on any anticipated carryover. And that moves us into section C. So as we get to section C, you'll see is the additional information section, and that really is it. This is a place where you can put all of the extra information about great things going on in your program. So I talked about in the executive summary, if you thought you were going to go over 2 pages, that there was somewhere you could put that additional information. This is that place. Okay. So that can keep your executive summary to a concise 2-page highlight reel, and then put all that additional info here in section C. So some of the particular information to make sure and include in section C. Document and highlight success stories. If you've already had some great things going on in your program, tell us about them. Tell us about particular challenges you've encountered. Make sure to include the status of partnerships. So many of you have partnerships as part of your program. Indicate whether those partnerships are still active, whether you have encountered hurdles with those particular partnerships, maybe a partner had to be replaced, and any key personnel changes. Remember that if it's a key personnel change, it also has to be sent to the department for approval. Just popping it in your section C won't suffice. You'll need to actually submit that to Jennifer for approval. Section C is also where you can indicate any planned changes to your project activities for the remainder of the year. So you may have some timelines that have changed up or some plans that have changed up because of COVID or because of changes in your organization or your community. This is the place to talk about that. Again, keeping in mind it still has to be within the scope and objectives of your approved grant application. This is also in particular because so many of the programs have had some potential changes specifically due to COVID. Make sure to point out those that are just general changes that are occurring in your program versus those that are specifically due to COVID. And then provide any other appropriate information about the status of your project, including any unanticipated outcomes or benefits. This is also the place. Have you maybe had a newspaper article written about your program? Because I know a couple of you have. Include that clipping. Did you have a really cool online event that maybe you have a recording of? Include that link. Include a picture. This is the place where you can put all of those extra bits and pieces that tell the story of your program. Now, some big tips on section C. Just like with the rest of G5 being a bit finicky, section C will work best if you put all of this information together into one PDF document. If you try to upload maybe a Word document and then this picture and then this scanned image, it's going to freak out and it's going to reject all of your things. If you will put everything together into one PDF document and just upload one PDF, it will typically take it no problem. The second warning on this has to do with pictures. So sometimes I say, oh, you can include pictures, and people may get a little overexcited and include 50 pictures. 50 pictures is never going to upload. You will wait and you will watch that little spinning thing and it's going to not take it. It's too large. Pick a highlight reel of photos or include a couple of photos and include a link to where some other photos are. But if you get too carried away with the photos, it makes your file much too large and it can't handle it. So it can take a fairly large PDF, but it can't take 50 photos. So I would suggest no more than 10 photos in that PDF to keep it to a manageable, uploadable size. Okay. And then this slide is solely for Albuquerque only. So if you're not Albuquerque, you can just tune out for one moment. For Albuquerque, this is here in section C, where you can also indicate if you plan to request a no-cost extension for 2021-2022. If that's something that you think you're going to be doing, this is not your actual request. This is just an intent to potentially request. Include in there the estimated length of no-cost extension that you would be requesting, keeping in mind that it can't be longer than 12 months. Make sure to provide sufficient details of what activities you plan to carry out during that time period and the estimated amount of funds to be spent on these activities. So basically, how much money would you want to carry over into your no cost extension period and what it would be used for. Remember that no cost extensions are not automatic and they're based on substantial progress. But if at this point you're thinking that that might be something that you would be requesting later in the year, this is the place to go ahead and include that intent, is here in section C. All right, the Albuquerque part is over. Everybody can pay attention again, because now we're going to talk about continuation awards. So the department makes every effort to process the continuation awards by the start date of your anticipated budget period. However, that can be made easier or harder by your reporting. Grantees who do not submit their APRs on time or who have lots of missing information, and I'm not talking about reporting 999, I mean when you literally skip entering information or enter it incorrectly, or who have not made substantial progress, could experience a delay in getting your continuation award. Because if the department is having to come back and ask lots of questions, or they're having to try and get your report from you after the deadline, all of those things slow down the process. And so it could delay your continuation award happening in a timely manner. Also, carryover requests. OIE will update you about any carryover requests. And remember that you should not assume that your carryover requests are automatically accepted or approved, particularly this early in the year. So a few big reminders as we think about reporting. Like I said, G5 opened for reporting on March 1st. Now we had a question about where in the world do you find these APR documents on G5? Okay, so in G5, you should be able to go in and open up a reporting package. There is potential that it may not be showing up for you, in which case we can definitely troubleshoot that. If you are having trouble locating it, you can always reach out, and I'll give you my email address here in 2 slides. So know that you can reach out and we can always get online together and try to locate it in your G5, but you should be able to, up through your top menu bar, open up the reporting package, and it should be under this particular PR number, because it won't list like NAL grant, it'll be under your PR number, and it will call it a reporting package. If you just want to see the ED524B forms, I'll send out the link to those specific forms, but also in your project planners that we shared in last week or week before last, project planning and reporting webinar, those are also set up exactly as the G5 system is. So couple of places you can look at them in your planner, download them from the ED524 link just off of the website that I'll share with you again. And then ultimately you need to be able to get into them through G5 through the reporting package. All right, and then just a reminder that again, only the grant project director of record in G5 is going to be able to submit the report, which means also, even if you potentially have a G5 account and you're not the project director, you will not have the reporting package showing up. Only those who are denoted in G5 as the project director will have access to that reporting package. Reminder that it is due May 3rd at 4:30 Eastern, even though I know all of you are going to turn it in well in advance of that, so that you don't have to stress with G5 being slow on the final day of reporting. And just a note that you're not able to go in and make any revisions after you submit your report. So I really want to stress that. It's not just that you won't be able to make any revisions after May 3rd. You'll notice you can make revisions as you're saving your information, but once you hit that final submit, you can no longer make any more revisions. So just be aware of that. And then the report's due on May 3rd, but we're reporting for a period of October 1st to March 31st. That is correct. Yeah, and that's just to make sure that between the end of March, which is the end of your reporting period for this particular report, you have enough time to get the data, analyze the data, and get it into the system. So typically there's always going to be usually 30 days between when the reporting period ends and when that report would actually be turned in. All right. And then just one more screen, just giving you a little reminder about when it's due. Maybe put a calendar reminder on your calendar. And then Veronica, I see your question about the reporting package. We can hop on separately, and we may want to look in G5 and just see what's going on and why it's not showing up. Because yeah, that is where that should be. All right, any other questions? I think I ran through the ones in the actual chat box, but if you have other questions that I've missed, please pop that in the chat box and we'll address those. While you're thinking about questions, I am going to pop up our standard end of event poll here. If you don't mind fast fingering in that question there. And yes, that is a Monday reporting deadline. So Monday, May 3rd. And that's also a good thing to remember that typically Sunday afternoons, G5 closes for maintenance. So if you look on that G5 website, it'll always tell you in advance when it's going to be closed for maintenance, but it has a tendency to be closed on Sunday afternoons and Sunday evenings for maintenance. So if you were thinking, well, I'm not going to do it May 3rd, but May 2nd on Sunday, I'll knock it out. The system's not going to be open most likely. So keep in mind those pieces as well, that sometimes it does have those maintenance windows and you don't want to get caught in any of that. All right, I do want to make sure that you have all of our contact information. You'll see there Jennifer's contact information. And I'm going to pop actually her correct email address here in the chat.
Sorry, one moment. My email address is actually diana.leo@ed.gov. I apologize. My name, I have two names, so that can be a little confusing.
Just keeps everybody on their toes.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, and I've popped Jennifer's email in the chat box, so you can actually just copy and paste it into your notes or anywhere that might be helpful. I also popped the email address for the OIATA team. So like I said, as you're working through your reporting and you have questions, please feel free to reach out. We are here to help you with that and happy to help. So that way you've got both of those in the chat box as well. And then I'm going to stop share and end our poll and give you one last opportunity if you happen to have any final questions. Yes, so we'll be sending out the recording, the slide deck, the link to the ED524 forms online, and the optional budget reporting form. We'll send all of that out via email. It will be this evening because I have another APR webinar with another group right after this. But as soon as we wrap that second APR webinar, I'll send out all that info to everybody via email. All right, well, it looks like we have run through all the questions. If you happen to have more and you're just busily typing, feel free to stay on and we'll answer those. But otherwise, we will wrap for today. Thank you for joining us for the NAL ED APR webinar, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.